G'day, y'all. This is episode number 2 of The Matt Sweeny Show. I talk with C. Bradley Thompson about capitalism. Let's go.
Hey, Matt, it's great to be with you.
So, the kind of spirit of this interview is speaking the truth in love, which is actually a quote from Ephesians 4:15 in the Bible. I kind of feel this is really about the pursuit of truth. So, with that, let's get started. So, is capitalism moral? I think a helpful starting point is to define terms so that we're talking about the same thing. So, to me, moral has to do with whether something is good or bad. So, is capitalism good or bad? And so that really brings us to define capitalism, and I'll take a crack at it. Capitalism is a system based on some key principles, including individualism, where the individual is the primary unit of moral value, and individual rights, including the right to life, the right to private property ownership, the right to freely form contracts, the right to voluntarily pursue self-interest according to an individual's own reason, freedom from initiation of physical force, and freedom from government interference, except for the government to provide the minimum systems necessary to protect these individual rights. So how does that sound to you?
Yeah, no, that you just took the words out of my mouth. You described, I think, all of the principal characteristics of capitalism. The one thing I would add to that, however, is that capitalism, in my view, is not how it's understood by most people, which is most people understand capitalism to be an economic system. And capitalism, to a certain degree, is an economic system, not as a cause, though, but rather as a consequence. So when I use the term capitalism, what I really mean to say or talk about is laissez-faire capitalism. Because otherwise, if you don't put the qualifier, then capitalism immediately, by the public impression, is often associated with it's associated with greed. It's associated with a kind of grasping, predatory selfishness. It's thought of as crony capitalism, a system which only benefits the wealthy. Or the capitalists, and that's not how I define capitalism. For me, capitalism is laissez-faire capitalism. So, what does laissez-faire mean? Laissez-faire means to let go or to be free, or hands off. And then the question would be, well, whose hands are to be kept off, or who or from whom are we to be set free? And the answer in every case is the government. So for me, laissez-faire capitalism, properly understood, is not primarily an economic system, but rather a political system. So the question then is, well, what does that mean? Well, as a political system, it has virtually all of the characteristics that you described. It begins with the individual as the primary unit of moral and political value. Individuals are self-owning and they are self-governing. And the individual in any free society is sovereign over his or her life, and able to exert the necessary effort in order to promote their own lives. And so the purpose of government in a free society, in a laissez-faire society, is to free the individual from government, and to allow individuals to openly and freely pursue their own self-interest. And by self-interest, I mean effectively what is said in the Declaration of Independence, namely the pursuit of happiness. And happiness is man's highest end or goal. So it's not this kind of low rent, predatory, grasping selfishness as it's often described. No, it's the pursuit of what is best in man, what is highest in man, and that is that is his happiness. And capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, is the system which allows man to pursue what is best for him or her. The last thing I will say is it seems to me that a central part of the definition of capitalism, if capitalism means laissez-faire capitalism, is that there must be a separation of economy and state. And for the very same reason that there must be a separation of church and state, school and state, and culture and state. In a laissez-faire capitalist society, we want the government's hands to be off of us, to let us free, to let us be, to control our own lives as we see fit.
Okay, great. So we've defined the principles behind capitalism. What is the effectively individualism and individual rights? What is their origin? What is the origin of these principles? Where do they come from? Who first wrote about them?
All right, so I'll start there. I'll start with your last question. Who first started writing about these principles? Well, that's a disputed question among scholars, but I think the shorthand answer to the question, certainly the person who is most identified with those principles would be the 17th century English philosopher John Locke. Now, what's interesting, Locke is most often associated with the concept natural rights, which is, interestingly enough, not a term that he almost ever used. I think, but I once read his famous Second Treatise of Government and found that he actually only used the word once, and it was in the preface. But still, a close reading of Locke's Second Treatise of Government, I think, clearly indicates that he understood, even if he didn't quite name the concept, and that concept is the concept of natural or individual rights. All right, so let me now and then sort of back into the other questions. You mentioned at the very outset that by this understanding, and by this understanding, I mean not just the Lockean understanding, but I also mean, I would put this whole philosophy, that is the philosophy of John Locke, Adam Smith, and America's founding fathers, under the label of classical liberalism. So the classical liberal view does begin, as you suggested earlier, it begins with the individual as the primary unit of moral and political value, as opposed, for instance, to the tribe, the clan, society, the general good, the public good, the common good. Those are not the primary unit of political value. In fact, in many ways, I think they're false or bogus concepts. So the classical liberal tradition begins with the individual, and it says that the individual is self-owning, self-governing, and therefore must be self-reliant in their lives. And connected to that idea, or coming out of that idea, is the notion of natural or individual rights. So on the one hand, you say the individual is the primary unit of moral and political value. On the other hand, however, individuals live in societies. Societies are made up of hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people. And even if every single individual in a society, let's say of 1 million people, never mind 330 million people like in the United States, even if all these people are rational and have goodwill, they're honest, and they're hardworking, in any society, anytime you put individuals together in society, eventually there will be conflicts. And there will be conflicts because human beings by nature are neither omniscient nor are they infallible. The fact of the matter is we have each individual has limited knowledge, and each individual is fallible. In other words, we make mistakes. And so even under the moral rule of good intentions, individuals will come into conflict. Never mind those individuals who are not of goodwill. those individuals who in fact are predatory, who are lazy, profligates, and such people in society will, they steal, they commit fraud, they commit assault, murder, rape, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, for individuals of goodwill in a free society, how can you have a free society of individuals who are not omniscient nor infallible? And this is where the concept of individual rights comes in. And I think the person who best defined what a right is the novelist philosopher Ayn Rand, who said rights are moral principles that define and sanction an individual's freedom of action in a social context. And so, in other words, now to use my own way of expressing this, the concept rights has a dual function. It serves on the one hand as a license to act. And on the other hand, it serves as a fence that protects us from other, let's say, predatory individuals. Now, the only way, though, in which the doctrine of rights can become meaningful in a free society is that you must have a government who can serve as a neutral arbiter to adjudicate disputes. And disputes will always arise, even in a free society made up of well-intentioned individuals. You need a neutral arbiter to settle disputes between individuals, and you also need a government in the form of a judge, or a government who can arrest, prosecute, and punish criminals, which means you obviously have to have a well-defined criminal code. Every free society will have a defined criminal code, and so the government plays a meaningful role in a free society, but a very limited role. Under the classical liberal understanding of what government is and what it should do, its purposes are limited simply to the protection of individual rights. And what that means in concrete terms is that the government in a free society will have a police force to arrest criminals. It will have a court system to either adjudicate disputes or to judge criminal cases, and it will have a military to defend the individuals of society against foreign enemies, or those who would violate the rights of when one nation violates the individual rights of the people who compose a second society. So in a free, laissez-faire capitalist society, there will be a government strictly limited to the purpose of protecting individual rights. And then once that happens, once the government creates this sphere of freedom, then what you have are ordinary, everyday individuals who are acting to, in the words of Adam Smith, they are acting to better the conditions of their lives. And the way in which we better the conditions of our lives, and every single person in the whole world, including Karl Marx, knew this. Each and every person, because man does not have an automatic code of values, and nature is such that all of the provisions that we need to live and to live well are not simply out there for us to walk and pick off a tree. Man must, unlike all other animals, man must use his mind to determine what his needs are, and since man is capable, unlike other animals, of happiness, he must also determine how to acquire happiness. And this means going out into the world, and it means thinking, and it means acting, it means producing, and it means trading. And then that's where the whole concept of private property comes into play, and the whole concept of contracts, which were two of the primary characteristics of a free capitalist society that you described. And then from there, then it's off to the races. People, I mean, if you or any of your listeners think about the world in which they live, most of the things that you have, like I'm looking at you sitting, Matt, in your office, and behind you, I see a book, I see a clock, I see a cabinet, and for you in the audience looking in my office, you see bookcases, you see a lot of books, table, and I got a lot of other stuff that you can't see, like a stapler and pens, and various other lights. You didn't create the things in your office. I didn't create the things in my office. They were created by other people. And you worked to create the wealth in order to engage in a trade with somebody who makes and sells clocks, somebody who makes and sells books, somebody who makes and sells cabinets, somebody who makes and sells the earphones that you have on right now, the shirt that both you and I are wearing, and the laptops or the computers that we're using right now to conduct this interview. Right? And in other words, in a free capitalist economy, every single day, literally hundreds of millions of transactions are taking place, not a single one of which was commanded from the top down by the government. It was each separate individual working for his own benefit to make his or her own life better. And yet all of us in this free market economy, we develop every single day. We're involved in interconnected relationships with other people, buying, selling, producing, et cetera, et cetera. And capitalism, I mean, you began the conversation, talking about the morality of capitalism. And of course, this is a disputed question. But let me tell you and your audience right now, in my view, capitalism is the only moral system. And it's the only moral system because it's the only moral system that protects, as its purpose, the rights of individuals, and promotes freedom. And these are the absolute necessary conditions for individuals to live good lives and to live in a free and prosperous society. So it's something like that.
Yeah. And so you mentioned John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, which was published in 1689, which is about 335 years ago. And I understand that is sort of, what is commonly considered the origin of individualism and individual rights. But as I was preparing for our discussion and thinking about this, it struck me that wasn't very long ago, especially in the context of human history. And so I got to thinking, is that really the origin? And as I looked at John Locke's Second Treatise of Government, right in the very first chapter, he opens that by talking about Adam and God. And so I sort of developed a hypothesis that I wanted to put to you and get your reaction to, and tell me if it's way off. But as I got to thinking about this, I thought, well, the hypothesis that I developed is that the Bible is the origin of the principles of capitalism. And so let me sort of break this down and talk it through. So the first principle of capitalism is individualism, which we talked about, where the individual is the primary unit of moral value. So from a biblical perspective, individuals are made in the image of God and therefore have innate value and rights. And so Genesis 1:27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. male and female, he created them. And I've tried to research like the origin of written text. It seems like there's a lot of debate, but it seems like the book of Genesis is arguably the oldest book ever written. And, therein lies the origin of individual rights. And so then sort of continuing to explore that, individualism seems to be the premise of how biblically God judges people, individually based on their hearts, not collectively based on their group. And so this is true both within the Old Testament and the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, it's in a lot of places, but Jeremiah 17:10 says, "I, the Lord, search the heart and test the mind, to give every man according to his ways, according to the fruit of his deeds." And Jesus said, "But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person." So let me just kind of pause here. I want to talk through individual rights one by one, but let me pause here and just get your reaction to the hypothesis that the heart of capitalism is individualism, which originates from the Bible.
Yeah. So there are, of course, many people who hold that view, and it was probably most famously made in Max Weber's book on capitalism and the Protestant ethic. And I think it is true that one of the first real understandings of individualism does come out of 16th century Protestantism. And because what the Protestant Revolution does is that it does, I think, in a certain way, as you suggest, it makes the individual the primary unit of value, at least in his relationship with God. And so what Protestantism does is to cut out the middleman. And the middleman, right, is the Pope and the Catholic Church. And it says that the individual can have a direct relationship with his God. And then I think it's also true to say that there is clearly some relationship between the rise of capitalism, particularly in Protestant nations, starting in the 17th century. But of course, this means that Protestantism, in certain ways, I think Protestantism sort of underwent some changes, and it put this new emphasis on work, which is interesting because Calvinism, which is at the heart of the new Protestantism, with its doctrine of predestination, which would suggest that not all individuals are selected by God's grace to go to heaven, but only the saints who have received the Lord's saving grace will go to heaven. But something happened, certainly in the 17th and 18th centuries, where it became possible even for Calvinists to at least open the doors or find the path through work, right? So there's a new emphasis in the so-called Protestant, the Protestant work ethic, suggesting that individuals can at least partly make their way to heaven. Now, I will also tell you, though, Matt, that I don't accept that view myself. Personally, I do not think that either the Bible or Christianity are the source of capitalism. And in many ways, I think my own view is that the Christian ethic, the teachings of Christ, actually go against the teachings of capitalism. Because in my view, at the heart of capitalism, and this is something that we haven't talked about yet, right? So we both began by suggesting that the individual is the primary unit of moral and political value, that the individual should be free, that the individual has rights, and that, and as I put it, the individual then has the right to pursue his or her happiness. But there's the rub, right? Because at the very heart of that, at the very heart of the suggestion of pursuing happiness, is really self-interest. So I think a proper understanding of capitalism, going even deeper than the individual, must begin with this idea, which obviously has been contested throughout all history, namely the idea of selfishness, or the better term is self-interest. Because, I mean, what is the pursuit of happiness other than the pursuit of one's self-interest? And the fact of the matter is, every single day, all human beings, every single human being who's ever lived, is to one degree or another acting in their own self-interest. And the challenge, I think, and this might have to be a conversation for another day, because I'd have to go back and sort of bone up on my New Testament. But the challenge is that I think the challenge is that the Gospels have always taught that the source of all evil, in fact, of all moral evil, is the idea of selfishness, and it's throughout the New Testament. All of the church fathers in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries AD, they all considered selfishness to be the great sin, and of course the Acts of the Apostles does at least present the view that what Christ has commanded for man is to live communally. And in fact, many of the church fathers argued that in fact we don't own our property, that the wealth of the riches is when you give charity to the poor, you're actually, and this is claimed by many church fathers, Saint Anselm, Augustine, they all claim that when you, sorry, I was getting an incoming call on my laptop, which I never do. Very interesting. Sorry. Their argument is that when you give charity, that what you're actually doing is giving back to people what was theirs in the first place. The suggestion being, right, that there is a kind of collective ownership of all wealth. Now, so long story short,
So
I think it's a debatable question. And my own view is that one of the great challenges to capitalism in a free society actually has been Christianity.
Well, that's really interesting, because in the course of sort of preparing for this interview, I found the exact opposite. And I found it just based on my own reading. So certainly not relying on any institutions kind of. And certainly this is something that we may want to dig into offline. But let me just share with you what I found, because what I found in my research is that the biblical teachings appear to me to be 100% consistent with capitalism. And that was very interesting, because just like for context, before I sat down and did this reading, based on what I had heard, like before I read the source material, based on what I had heard and based on what I'd read online, was exactly what you just described. But then when I actually went and read and studied the source material, I'll share with you what I found.
Sure.
So starting sort of from the top is the greatest commandments, which are to love God and to love your neighbor. So Jesus was asked, "Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law?" And he said to him, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself." On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So sort of running through the key principles of capitalism that we agreed kind of definitionally on up front, the next is the right to life. So the right to life certainly flows from this, because if you love God and your neighbor, you're not going to murder your neighbor who's made in the image of God. And just in case there was any ambiguity, like, you shall not murder is one of the 10 commandments. So kind of going from the right to life to the next principle, or a series of principles, there's the right to private property ownership, the right to freely enter contracts, the right to voluntarily pursue self-interest according to an individual's own reason. There's freedom from the initiation of physical force and freedom from government interference. And I found that all of these principles, at least based on my reading, are embodied in a single sentence in the New Testament. And when I read this, it blew my mind. So it's in a parable about laborers in a vineyard. And the sentence is, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? So that sentence, just thinking about it, am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? That's private property ownership. The story is about the right to voluntarily enter into contracts. That implies the voluntary pursuit of self-interest, freedom from initiation of physical force, and freedom from government interference. And so it seemed to me that the core tenets of capitalism were all encapsulated in this parable. And then sort of, okay, so if my read, let's just, for the sake of argument, say, okay, the read on that is correct, which is that individualism is biblical and individual rights are biblical. Well, I think then the next step is, well, what does the Bible say about the morality of self-interest, to your point? And what I found there is, first of all, that with individual freedom comes individual responsibility, the responsibility to work. Quote, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. That is a remarkably capitalist principle. Then sort of beyond that, there's also the responsibility of the individual to provide for his family. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. And then from there, it was actually, and interestingly, that money is not bad in and of itself, and in fact, wealth can be a gift from God. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. But where then sort of the morality of it comes in is that wealth and money in and of itself is not a bad thing. In fact, it can be a good thing. It's really about where your heart is. And what I understand the key message to be is to love God and people, not money. So the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. And those who receive the gift of wealth are encouraged to be a good custodian of it. There's the parable of the talents, where the lazy person who didn't invest the money for a return, that was the sin. It was those who invested the money and got a return on it who were considered the good custodians. And it seemed to me that the Bible actually recognizes that people pursue their own self-interest, and that really it's a call to voluntary charity. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. So for what it's worth, I found this to be an extremely interesting study, where what I had heard wasn't what I found. What I found is full consistency between capitalism and the Bible, except the Bible just goes to the next level of then challenging you to voluntarily, on the basis of charity, use your wealth for good.
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple things to say in response. The first is just one small point on the parable of the talents, which you mentioned, which I will tell you, and I'm happy for you to enlighten me. I've never quite understood the meaning of that for the following reason. The rich landowner gives gives money to each of three servants. But I don't think he gives the same amount of money. He gives differing amounts of money to each of the three servants. And I believe he asks them to hold the money until he returns. And the one who received the most money invested it and got the biggest return. The second one who received the second most amount of money invested it and got the second greatest amount of return. And the third person, rather than investing the money, just buried the money and held it, right? But as I read the parable of the talents, none of the three servants were asked to invest the money. The three servants were not asked to return the original amount plus more. They were just asked to hold the money. And when I first read it, I thought, well, the story would be, right, that some gave the money away or lost the money. And therefore, there would be reasonable moral judgment against somebody who has, in effect, stolen the money. But the servant who just simply buried the money and gave back the same amount that he was given, it seems to me, fulfilled the request of his master. Whereas the two who invested the money and returned more than they received, they actually didn't follow the commandment, which was just simply to hold the money. And instead, they invested it. And of course, they could have invested the money and lost the money. What would have happened had they lost the money? So I've just never understood, to be honest, how the parable of the talents actually just how it makes sense.
Let me try to answer that.
Yeah.
And look, I'm not an expert. This is just kind of like my read on this. But
Sure.
Towards the end, in response to the one who buried the money, it said, quote, "You ought to have invested my money with the bankers, and at my coming I should have received what was my own with interest." So my read on that is that the message is to be a faithful steward of the gifts that God has given you, which may include wealth. And it's also effectively a warning against laziness and not making those investments. And it's told multiple times in the book of Matthew and in the book of Luke. And in the version in Luke, I believe there's a quote that specifically says, "Engage in business until I come." So it really reads to me as consistent with the core tenets of capitalism.
Yeah. So I think, you and I can agree to disagree, or at least we can say on the surface that, we have a different way of viewing this. And I think what would be really interesting and important for us to do is to sit down and have a real conversation about this. And of course, that would mean that I have to go back and read a text that I haven't read in really in decades. But in many ways, though, Matt, and look, let me just say a couple things. The first is, 98% of all great American businessmen and capitalists at the end of the 18th century, in the 19th century, and into the 20th century were Christians. Right. And there is obviously some interesting correlation.
I did not know that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's no real insight on my part. It's just the fact that in, let's just say 19th century America, 98% plus of all Americans were Christians. Ergo, the logic would tell us, right, that all of the capitalists were Christians, and many of them, like Andrew Carnegie, for instance, were devout Presbyterians, and gave great amounts of wealth to their churches. So it's simply a fact, right, that in the most capitalist nations in history, particularly in the European North and including Great Britain, and then in the United States, that it's not simply the fact that they're Christians, but they're Protestants. and that means something too. But so there's something to examine there. But let me also say this. See, so let's say, in fact, in the end, you and I do have a difference of interpretation. You argue that the Bible is the source of capitalism, and I argue that it's not, and not simply that it's not, but there's much in it which is opposed to it. Right? It seems to me, however, that your real disagreement is not with me, because so let's just say, again, for argument's sake, we both agree that capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, is the most just, the most efficient, the most productive economic system, political economic system ever invented by man. And I think probably we do both agree with that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So on that level, you and I are in complete agreement. And then you go one level lower philosophically to sort of the moral teaching. And we both, let's say, for argument's sake, we both agree that the individual is the primary unit of moral and political value. We both agree in the idea of individual rights. And so, for, most of the argument, and for the world in which we live today, we agree on virtually everything. In the end, however, where we might disagree, right, is on the source, like the deepest level. We disagree on, or we might disagree on the ultimate source. You might say that the Bible is the source. I might say that it's not. I might even go further and say that it actually works against those things that we stand for. But on 90% of everything, we agree. It seems to me, however, that, and I'm not even suggesting, I don't even know whether the view that you've just laid out is your own personal view, but let's, for argument's sake, say that it is.
Yep.
All right. Seems to me that the real disagreement that you must have is not with me, but it's with fellow Christians. Because the Christian church today, both Catholic and Protestant, is and has been for a good century. It has been, I won't say dominated by the left, but as you know, let's just take mainline Protestant churches in the United States, there is a huge chasm, you could say, between left-wing Protestants and right-wing or conservative Protestants. You could say that there's a division between Christians who support capitalism and Christians who support socialism. And the same is true, very much true, of course, in the Catholic Church. So it seems to me that if you are pro-capitalism, pro-limited government, pro-individual rights, pro-individualism, and also a Christian, and then there is a significant number of Christians, on the other hand, who are anti-capitalism, anti-limited government, anti-individualism, anti-natural rights, because according to them, it goes against the Bible, then it seems to me that the real conflict, and this is something I tell my Christian friends all the time, like, your battle is not with me. Your battle is with your fellow Christians who are promoting socialism. In other words, and I apologize to put this, I'm putting this now in very strong terms, but you need to clean house, right? Christians need to clean house.
So I would just say yes. And I mean, I think it goes back to a point you made earlier, which is the Protestant Reformation was about cutting out the middleman. It was about how at some point between the life of Jesus and the biblical writings and what was it, the 1500s, the Catholic Church had grown as an institution, and I mean, let me ask you this, that old adage of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. I mean, isn't that consistent with the principles of capitalism that we agreed upon? And isn't that really why it's about the individual as the supreme moral unit? Because the moment you shift away from individualism to collectivism, you end up with institutions that get corrupted over time. And so I would say, yes, absolutely. The Christian view that I hold is that you cut out the middleman. It's about your relationship with God. It's about you reading the original texts and developing your own understanding. And I think that there is a constant attack on the institutions to corrupt them. And the defense against that is your own heart. It's individualism. It's having a direct relationship with God. So yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, I would go back to what I said just a moment ago. Um, you know, Christians, both Catholic and Protestant, I mean, those who support laissez-faire capitalism, limited government, individual rights, you need to clean house because the church has been corrupted.
Absolutely.
And
Let me give you an example of this. And this is something
yeah.
that is just really interesting to observe and something that I don't think is talked about enough. But what's the name of the church that just had the great split?
Well, it seems like I hear about a split in, a church just about once every 6 months. But like the Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, all of the mainline Protestant churches, right? They have conservative and liberal wings.
The United Methodist Church.
United Methodist Church, yeah.
So, I mean, this is a classic example. The United Methodist Church is an institution, and that institution appears to have been taken over by a collectivist ideology that is not following the biblical teachings on morality, on sexual relations. And so what happened is those who are kind of staying true to themselves and their beliefs have left that institution and decentralized. I think that's a great example of what you're describing.
It's a partial example, I would say, of what I'm describing, right? So, yeah, if you belong to a church and you think the church is promoting moral political policies that promote political collectivism, statism, or let's just put it more simply, socialism of one kind or another, then one of two things has to happen. You either have to fight and resist and overcome, or you have to leave and you form your own church. But still, the fact of the matter is, and I'm just making these numbers up, but let's just assume it's roughly speaking true. Half of Methodists support capitalism, half of Methodists support socialism, half of Lutherans support capitalism, half support socialism. Same is true of Baptists, and same is true of Protestant or Presbyterians, and many other denominations. So, I mean, unlike the Catholic Church, where there is no secessionism, right? That's not possible in the Catholic Church. You can leave, but it leads to excommunication. What you still have, though, is a divided church within Protestantism, divided denominations, and so again, it seems to me that the real battle of pro-capitalist Protestants is with anti-capitalist Protestants, and you need to get your house in order first. That's
I agree with you. I agree with you. So this
Yeah.
is actually, and just a comment would be, feels like history is repeating itself, because this is this feels like what happened with the original Protestant Reformation, where the Catholic Church got to the point where it was trying to charge people money to get into heaven, and Martin Luther said no, 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 and he hammered his 95 Theses into the door of the church at Wittenberg. Feels like that's what's happening again, but uh, the same sort of collectivist type ideology, but perhaps just through a different topic. This time it's about sexuality, that time it was about money. But yes, I agree. I agree that Christians need to fight the battle and get their house in order. But this is actually a good segue into another question that I had for you, which is, so this is episode 2. Episode 1, I interviewed G. Edward Griffin, who 40 years ago conducted a famous interview with Yuri Bezmenov. And let me just give you the context on this. Yuri Bezmenov was a KGB agent who defected to the West. And he, after defecting, sort of came out and did a series of interviews where he said, here's what's really going on. And so let me summarize for you what he said. What he said is that communists are at war with America, and that this is an ideological or a moral war between the collectivist ideology behind communism and the individualist ideology behind the founding of America. And he said that the communists realized that they weren't able to defeat America militarily or economically. And so they developed a different weapon for fighting this war. And that weapon is a form of brainwashing from within. And he had a word for it, which is called ideological subversion, or also known as active measures. And the origin of this, the origin of the principle behind this goes all the way back to Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which says that excellence in warfare is breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. So destroying them before you get to the battlefield, destroying them from within. And so he explained that there's been a process going on, which is a long-term process consisting of demoralizing entire generations by attacking key areas within American society, including chiefly religion, education, and media. And there are more pillars that are under attack, but they're the big 3. And so the nature of the attack is that it changes the victim's perception of reality and causes them to believe that communism is a viable alternative to capitalism, and that it's an irreversible attack because when this ideology takes hold of someone's mind, it's impossible to re-educate them. They end up seeing the world through that lens. And so a few other interesting points, but perhaps the most important one is he said that 80 to 85% of KGB resources were poured into this attack, which means that it was basically been financed by unlimited money. And the attack began in the 1960s, meaning that America today is 3 to 4 generations into this attack. And when it brainwashes enough people within a generation, it leads to a civil war or an internal revolution, the goal of which is to destroy America from within. And the end goal is to turn America from an open capitalist society into a closed collectivist society where it can merge with one global system. And Yuri fled to the West. And so he said, believe me, if you destroy your system, you will have no place to defect to because America is the last hope for mankind's survival, freedom, and justice. And so what I find really interesting about this theory is its predictive value. Because the things that he predicted 40 years ago seem to me to be happening, and you can actually see the trend lines. And so as someone who has focused on studying capitalism, but also as someone who is an educator, and who's like within seen what's been happening in American educational systems, what's your perspective on this? And I'm interested in what you see within the higher education system, and if you also see this trend towards collectivism, socialism, Marxism within universities.
Yes, yes, and yes is the simple, short answer to the question. So everything that you presented as Bezmenov's views, I think is true. He described, as you presented it, virtually perfectly what has happened in the United States. And do I believe that this was an intentional program of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc? Yes, I do. I think that is absolutely true. And we can observe in our own lives today how this has actually worked out. So actually, it was the New Left in the 1960s in the United States and in West Germany who described what Bezmenov has, what he's argued for. They described it as the long march through the institutions. And this is precisely what the left in the United States, in Canada, I mean, really in the entire so-called free world, in Central and South America and in Western Europe, there has been this 60, 70-year long march through the ideas. So the question then is why the long march through the institutions? Why did the left, and it doesn't particularly matter whether it originates with the Soviet Union or whether it originates with Western intellectuals. The fact of the matter is, by the 1920s, communist thinkers came to understand and realize that there would never be, as Marx predicted, a global working class revolution. That is to say, there would never be a revolution from the bottom up of, workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. The problem with Marx's argument is that the workers themselves in North America, South America, and in Western Europe, they never thought they were in chains. And in fact, they were the greatest beneficiaries of the enormous wealth produced by capitalism. And, with every generation, the standard of living for the so-called working class just kept going up and up and up. And the left-wing intellectuals in the 20s and 30s, they realized, that in fact that the so-called working class is not only not a pro-revolutionary force, it's an anti-revolutionary force. It turns out, guess what? The so-called working class is the most non-revolutionary and the most conservative force in society. It's the working class which is most dedicated to preserving the manners and mores, let's just put it, of Western culture, whether it's families, schools, churches. I mean, all of the institutions that had prior to communism held society together. It was the working class that was most dedicated to preserving those institutions. And so therefore, beginning really in the 30s, left-wing intellectuals developed a new strategy for advancing Marxism. And they got rid of all of the Marx's economic interpretation of history. They got rid of this idea of class conflict, and they actually turned Marx on his head. And what they did was they came to realize that if there's going to be a revolution in this country, it's not going to come from the working class. It's going to come actually not from the bottom, but rather from the top, from the intellectual classes. And so, they took seriously what is traditionally considered to be a conservative principle, namely, ideas have consequences. And what the left did was they began this long march through the institutions to capture first and foremost America's universities, which they have now captured entirely. And because they were able to capture first the universities, they were then able to capture the entire K-12 education system. So now they've got complete control of not just K through 12, but also university education, which means if you control the universities, that means eventually you're going to control not just the schools, you're going to control the churches, you're going to control the media, you're going to control Hollywood. In other words, you're going to control all of the culture forming institutions of society. And in that, they have been a stunning success. While at the same time, conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, and objectivists have, for the most part, been asleep at the wheel. Right? There's a sense in which we have allowed this to happen. And so the question then is, do we just put our hands up and say, surrender, put up the white flag, or are there strategies to either regain the institutions or start new ones? And I think that's the major question for all of us going forward.
Why aren't more people talking about this? It seems like it's amazing to me that this isn't the discussion that everyone is having.
Yeah. Now, why it's not the conversation everybody is having is in part just because the left does control the opinion forming institutions, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, with every passing year, the number of Americans, or let's say the percentage of Americans who believe in the principles of the American founding, which are in effect the summation of the principles of they are the existential embodiment of the principles of classical liberalism and of the Enlightenment. Those numbers, that is to say, the people who hold those principles as true and worth defending, that percentage declines a little bit every single year.
I want to talk about this more, and I want to talk about potential solutions, but just with what you just said, something came to mind. There's another hypothesis I've been thinking about. Let me just get your reaction to it. So the hypothesis is this. It's possible that, in my opinion, it's possible that we're actually entering or have entered a new dark age. So let me explain that. So preparing for this interview was difficult because when I use Google as a search engine to try to find information on the morality of capitalism, I'm returned with overwhelmingly negative results. It's trying to give me its answer, not the answer. You then sort of combine that with the trends that I've heard happening at universities where I'm told that students, because they have a smartphone in their hand, are devaluing actually having knowledge because they think they can just use a device to find it. Why do they need to have the knowledge? Why do they need to understand it? Why do they need to know who they are or what the truth is if they can outsource that to a device? And then in the course of outsourcing that to a device, I mean, I've already just mentioned what's happening with Google, but now you look at artificial intelligence. I mean, I can see AI becoming, in the very near future, effectively the operating system for the phone. So I see this trending in the direction of not even having to go to a search engine, but just, saying to the phone, which is an AI system, which may have its own goals or objectives, like it. How can you find truth if the intermediary to the truth not only doesn't want you to find it, but may be deliberately giving you the wrong information? And so I actually am developing this hypothesis that we may be further gone than people think. There might be kind of some last flickering lights of what you've referred to as classical liberalism, what I've referred to as individualism, that, may be on the way out here. So just what's sort of the reaction to the new dark age hypothesis?
Yeah, I mean, I would be lying if I said to you and to your audience that I don't think we're in deep trouble. We are in deep, deep trouble. And it gets worse with every passing year. But that doesn't mean, however, we are not yet at the point where we either, raise the white flag and surrender, nor are we at the phase where it's time to to move to New Zealand. Or some, which I know has its own problems.
New Zealand's got its own problems.
Yeah, no, I understand. I'm just thinking of like some mysterious valley.
Yeah.
Some mysterious valley hidden somewhere on the South Island of New Zealand, which of course doesn't exist. So I was using it sort of more metaphorically, or some isolated island in the South Pacific. Or the South Atlantic, actually, but no, that's not the solution. And I'll tell you why it's not. Giving up, surrendering is not the solution. For the following reason. There used to be this old slogan used by Hungarian anti-communists in the 1950s, which was, "Situation bad, not yet hopeless." Or no, sorry, it's the reverse of that. I messed that up. Situation hopeless, not yet bad. And what that means is that, there's always hope. And that's, as bad as things seem right now, and they are. I'm a father. I just recently became a grandfather.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I'm going down with the ship. Or to change the metaphor, if my life is going to be defined by the Alamo, then it'll be defined by the Alamo. I'm going down.
Yeah.
And which means I'm going down fighting.
Yes.
And what other choice do you have other than to live in a state of perpetual cynicism, which is not a good life.
So it seems like, just kind of like from the top, we're aligned on the core principles of capitalism, although there's a question about its origins. We're aligned on the diagnosis of the current problem. So let's talk about what the solution is. Now, it sounds like, from your perspective, you're working on an element of that solution. But so, I mean, up to you how you want to kind of approach the discussion. But the question is, what are the potential solutions to the problem, given that you and I are both aligned on what we're aspiring for capitalism to be? We're both aligned on where we're at and how we got here. How do we right this ship?
Right. That's the $64,000 question. The first thing I would say is no compromise with the left, ever. Ever. That's number one. Number two, conservatives, libertarians, classical liberals, objectivists need to start doing what they claim they stand for, which is they need to start being entrepreneurial. And of course, that's premised, though, as you were, I think, indicating just a couple of minutes ago, people need to wake up. People, we can't win if most people are just living in their dogmatic slumbers. We need to wake up. We need to be activists. And by that, what I mean is we need to be activists for a free society. And each person can do that, in their own way, whether it's writing letters to your local newspaper, I can tell you at the macro level, the big things that have to happen, and in fact are now just starting to happen, would be at the university level. And so I would say this, and everybody knows this now: what can't go on forever won't. And that is true of American higher education. American higher education, as I speak, is imploding. And it's imploding for a number of reasons. It's imploding first and most obviously ideologically, right? And you know, tens of millions of Americans have seen this play out in real time in the last 9 months since October 7th, right? We see what's happening on America's college campuses. And what we see are the universities have literally been taken over by what I call the intifada left, which is like the most horrifying thing possible. It's the unification of Marxism, socialism, Marxian socialism, and Islam, right? And you know, and it's going to get worse before it gets better. So we need to wake up. We need to see what's happening. All right, now on the flip side, the positive side. Let me begin by talking about what I'm doing. And what I'm doing at Clemson University is in 2005, I started something called the Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism. And our mission, in a phrase, is to explore the moral foundations of capitalism. So, you know, there are dozens of free market think tanks around the country, but they're all run by and for economists. And their argument is that capitalism is the best system, economic system, because it's the most productive and efficient. The problem with that, and that's true. The problem with that argument, however, is that even Karl Marx knew that was true, that capitalism is the most productive and efficient economic system ever devised by man. The problem with capitalism from Marx's perspective is that it's immoral and unjust. And so in the arguments against the left, you know, most of these free market think tanks, they always lose the battle, because in any battle between morality and economics, morality, which is claimed by the left, and economics, which is claimed by pro-free marketers, in any battle between morality and economics over the long term, morality always wins. Hands down, always wins. And so at Clemson, our Clemson Institute for the Study of Capitalism, we focus on the moral foundations of capitalism. And then most importantly, we have created 9 years ago, what has become our premier academic program called the Lyceum Scholars Program. It's a scholarship program. We give 10 scholarships per year. We're hoping to go up to 20 in a year. 20 scholarships to incoming freshmen, renewable over 4 years. And in exchange for the scholarship, the students have to take our 8-course academic curriculum. We use a great books approach to studying the history of liberty, capitalism, the American founding, and the principles of moral character. And students, just to very quickly, I won't go through all 8 courses, I'll just give you a few. Students take a course called Wisdom of the Ancients, a course in ancient Greek and Roman moral thought. They do a course on the political thought, the political theory of capitalism, a course on the political theory of the American founding, and a course called Wisdom of the Moderns, which is modern moral thought, Shakespeare through Adam Smith, Dostoevsky, Milton Friedman, Ayn Rand. And this program has absolutely exploded. When we started it 9 years ago, we had 190 applications our first year. For next year's incoming freshman class, over 1,000 applications for 10 slots. So what that tells me is that there is a huge demand out there, an absolutely huge demand for the kind of education that we're offering. And in just the last 3 years, right? So 1,000 applications incoming and outgoing in the last 3 years. We've had in the Lyceum program at Clemson University 2 winners of a Fulbright scholarship. We've had Clemson University's first and only Rhodes Scholar. We have a student at Harvard Law School, student at Chicago Law School. We have 6 doing PhDs. We have 3 doing masters at Oxford, 1 at Cambridge, et cetera, et cetera. So this program has just been a phenomenal success. And the good news is that I take calls on a semi-regular basis from people who want to emulate what we're doing at Clemson. So slowly we're trying to create a city upon a hill, which will be a source, hopefully, of reforming higher education. But maybe even more importantly, what's been happening in just the last 3 or 4 years is that we're now seeing the creation of new colleges and universities in the United States. Colleges and universities which are based on, let's say, more traditional or even conservative libertarian principles. The best known of these, of course, is the University of Austin in Texas. They're about to launch their first class this coming August. And there's a small college in Savannah, Georgia, Ralston College. So there are, and some others. Now, what's also interesting is that one college or university in the United States today is going out of business. One a week. One college a week is going out of business. What that means is that every single year there are 54 colleges which are up for sale, which means some really smart conservative, libertarian, classical liberal, objectivist education entrepreneur who wants to start a new college, you can literally buy an entire college at fire sale prices. 120-acre campus in rural Vermont, beautiful campus with 22 buildings, classroom buildings, administrative buildings, athletic facilities, sold for $5 million. Like, that's nothing. $5 million is nothing. So anyway, the people who believe in a free society, that you need to put your money where your mouth is. And you can't just cede everything to the left.
So those people out there who this is resonating with, what can they do to help you?
Well, certainly relative to the Clemson Institute, on principle, we don't take government money. And so, what that means is we are self-funded. I have to raise $1.5 million every year to pay the salaries of my faculty and my staff. So obviously, if there are people listening to this podcast who are interested in the work we're doing, go to our website, just Google Clemson Capitalism, will come up. Scroll around, visit us, see who we are. People should feel free to call me. I'm happy to take phone calls from people who are interested in what we're doing, either who would like to support us or who would like to replicate what we're doing at their own college or university.
So that's great, and I hope you get all the funding you need. Let me use this as an opportunity also to share what we're doing. So this is a new initiative, the Freedom Center at Tusculum University, and very, very similar alignment on goals. Kind of at the core, we're looking to do 2 things. One is to create freedom-oriented content. So that's interviews and discussions like this with folks who are experts on issues of freedom, but it's also debates, because there are many college campuses in America today where you can't even go and have a debate anymore. And we want to provide a platform for debates. So that's kind of piece 1. Piece 2 is my background is as an entrepreneur. So I went through the Y Combinator startup accelerator program in Silicon Valley that has funded more than 5,000 companies. I think they're approaching $1 trillion in value of the companies that have been through that program. I started a company myself that's that sought to pioneer the future of aviation with drone delivery. And I would say, certainly I take responsibility, but what I would say is that the main reason drones aren't delivering packages in America today is because of the federal bureaucracy. The Federal Aviation Administration, people just can't even comprehend how how massively innovation is delayed, and how many jobs, wealth, and life-saving technologies have been blocked by the bureaucracy. But anyway, that's another story. But what we're seeking to do is help founders start companies on campus, and for that then to be an economic engine that drives. And we see the two things as fitting together, because if entrepreneurs have an education in what you've called classical liberalism, free market economics, and freedom, and then go and start companies, and those companies are successful, they'll then give back. And that then kind of creates almost like an ecosystem that can help to solve this problem. So similarly, we're very interested in attracting the funding to help ensure that this can grow as fast as it deserves to. These are two really interesting initiatives looking at solving the problem. Since we both feel like Yuri Bezmenov defined the problem, I thought it might be interesting to have a discussion about the solution that he proposed. So what Yuri said is, let me see if I can pull it up actually. From memory, what he said is, the solution to demoralization is to be moral. So he took this extraordinarily kind of complex institutional attack, and he said the solution is to be moral. And he meant that, I believe he meant that in a Christian sense, but he also meant that in a philosophical sense, in terms of embracing the principles of individualism and capitalism. And I thought that was a remarkably simple articulation of a solution to a very complex problem. How do you sort of react to that?
Yeah. No, I agree entirely. And in fact, his principle, and you could say, is built into the Lyceum Scholars Program. So, every year, both at Clemson University and the lectures that I give around the United States and sometimes around the world, I meet a lot of young people, college age people. And when I ask them the question, what do you want to do, when you grow up? What do you want to be what do you want to be doing in 10 years? The answer from young people, not surprisingly, is usually, oh, I want to change the world. And then it occurred to me one day, and there's something admirable about that. But, there's also something deeply conceited about that some 20-year-old thinks that they're going to change the world. And so when I hear that from students, I say, well, yeah, okay, and because there's a sense, right, in which I want to change the world. However, before you think about telling other people how to live their lives, because if you're going to change the world, that's what you're doing. You're going to change the way in which other people live their lives. And you're really, in effect, saying, I know how to live your life and you don't. So, listen to me. And it's a conceit, right? And in many ways, it's the conceit of youth. And so my response to these students all the time is, before you think about changing the world, you might want to just think about changing yourself first. And changing yourself first might take you the next 20 years, right? And in other words, what I tell them is, the first thing you must do is get right with yourself. And in getting right with yourself, that means to, and I take this line from Václav Havel's wonderful anti-communist essay. He was a Czech. His essay, "The Power of the Powerless," where the message of that essay is to, quote, live in the truth. And the fact of the matter is, most people, most of the time, do not literally live in the truth. We all have our petty little lies. We all have our petty little rationalizations and myths. But each and every person as an individual, if you're going to believe in the philosophy and if you're going to support the philosophy of individualism, which I do, you better be a model, right? I don't want to change the world. Here's really what I guess I want to do. I want to be a model to help other people change their lives, but they can only do that on their own, right? I can't force them to be better than they are, and to change the world most of the time, unless you're Elon Musk or some great inventor, 99.999% of the world, none of us change the world, even though that might be our aspiration. But you can do the one thing that you have power over, and that's yourself. In other words, you should spend your time trying to become the best person that you can be. And that means, first and foremost, to live in the truth. And the truth is a relationship. The truth is it's a relationship between an idea and a proposition and reality. So then you relate that back to yourself. How do I live in the truth? Well, one way in which you can live in the truth is, first, most people have moral principles that they hold to be true. Now, it's also the case that most people don't live principled lives in accordance with their own self-declared principles all the time. They compromise on their principles all the time. But I want to go even further. The first thing you have to do is you have to ask the question, are the principles, the moral principles that I hold to be true, are they actually true? So then you would have to ask the question, well, how would I know if they're true or not? And that requires a whole new perspective on the world. And you have to have some way by which to validate your principles as true. That's number one. Number two, then you have to figure out, all right, I hold these principles, to quote the Declaration, I hold these truths to be self-evident. And let's say they're moral truths. All right, I'm now convinced that they're true. The question now is, am I living according to those principles all of the time? And that's the really hard test, right? Because the fact of the matter is, most people do not live according to their principles all the time. The fact is, most people compromise on their principles at least some of the time. So then you have to ask the question, well, why just take your own self? Why do I compromise my principles some of the time? And you need to reflect on why that is the case. And, the most common reason I think most people compromise their principles at some point is because they want to fit in. They want to be liked by other people. Which is a kind of second-handedness. You mentioned earlier in our conversation Gen Z and their peculiarities. One of the peculiarities of Gen Z is that because of social media and their phones, they live according to likes, right? They want to be liked, and the way in which they're liked is by posting things on TikTok or on Instagram that get a lot of likes, right? And so you become a likes chaser, right? And all of a sudden now you're more concerned with getting likes than you are with speaking truth to power. So anyway, this is a very long way of saying that I think it's the case that what most people, young people in particular, need to do, and they can be helped by older people, is to focus first and foremost on developing your moral character. Let me just add one last thing. Let me share with you a line from one of my favorite movies. The movie is Rob Roy. Film, I don't know, at least probably 20 years old now, starring Liam Neeson. And it's I think it's of William Wallace, or some 15th century Scottish fighter against English oppression. And everybody in the world hates English oppression, particularly us Scots. And at one point in the movie, his young son says to him, "Father, what is honor?" And Rob Roy, played by Liam Neeson, turns to his son and says, "Honor is a man's gift to himself." Right? So honor, that's the reverse of how Gen Z live their lives. Gen Z live their lives second-handedly by getting likes on their posts, right? But if honor is a man's gift to himself, the honor that is most important, right, is the honor associated with knowing that I have lived and am living a good and honorable life.
That's super interesting. I've also heard from educators that Gen Z, and I know we're generalizing, but that generally Gen Z, like, it's to the point where some students are so worried about being on the receiving end of a viral moment that they're not even willing to take the podium and speak or debate. And you can't seek truth, you can't find truth unless you're willing to take that risk and have that debate and engage in these kind of discussions and take some risk. And so these are not good signs as to the direction the next generation is going. Now, in terms of proposed solutions, I did find the original quotes from Yuri Bezmenov. He said 3 things. 1, my solution is simple. You don't want to be demoralized. Stay moral. And he was really talking about that from a religious perspective, with rights coming from God from his point of view. Second, he said on education, you have to educate a new generation of Americans, this time in the spirit of patriotism and capitalism. And third, media. He said, start your own media and watch conservative religious media. And he said, in any case, even if you start the education of a new generation of Americans right this minute, it will take you the next 15 to 20 years to raise this new generation to the levels of power and authority. You may reduce this period of time if you can make an enormous all-nation effort in an atmosphere of prevailing unity and consensus. So I just thought it would be interesting to hear his perspective. But this also reminds me of a few quotes. One is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who wrote the Gulag Archipelago and was really kind of the voice that tracked the worst excesses of communism in the Soviet Union. He said, if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. So I just found that super interesting as a quote. So this segues into another question I had for you, which is, so, we've talked about capitalism, but what are the alternatives to capitalism? And with, if we do sort of define capitalism as kind of from, Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, well, this is a fairly modern, state of society. If we're not a capitalist society, and so if we think historically, but also think in terms of what we could devolve into if we don't right this ship, what are the alternatives? Like, what was the dominant economic system pre 1700s. What was the life of the ordinary person like, and what was the economic system that prevailed?
Well, I mean, certainly prior to the rise of the classical liberal era, the rise of capitalism and enormous wealth production, I think the quality of life for most people, including the wealthiest and most aristocratic of people living in the 15th or 16th centuries, was summed up most famously, I think, by the 17th century, mid 17th century English philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who described something he called the state of nature. The state of nature is that place where there is no government. But I think what he was saying applies to societies with governments at that time as well. And that is, in a state of nature, life is nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And I think that basically sums up what life was like for most people. Certainly, I mean, relative to our standards, I mean, what I, I live I live a very comfortable middle-class life. Would I switch my place today for the position of the wealthiest person and the most powerful person in 16th century England, which was the wealthiest nation in the world at that time? No, never in a million years. I mean, to be the king of England in the 15th or 16th centuries, which is, not that long ago. Never mind the 8th century or 5th century Athens. Life was nasty, poor, brutish, and short. And I mean, the wonders of the world.
What was it? Was it feudalism? Were people working the land? Was it serfdom? Because I think a lot of people who are criticizing capitalism in today's world maybe don't actually just have the context of what life was like 500 years ago.
I think that's absolutely correct. And that, by the way, is true not only of the left, but it's also true of a small but growing movement on the right, which effectively they are hardcore, and there are many different flavors of this, but let me identify one particular flavor, the so-called trad Caths. That's traditional Catholics. They want to return to a world where the Pope rules the world, and they want to return to a world they want to get rid of capitalism, they want to return, they have some sort of fairy tale bucolic vision of what life was like in the 16th or 17th centuries. Before there were machines, before there were factories, before there were iPhones. And by the way, just for those Arsenal fans out there, I am a supporter. But life was not as they want to portray it. Back in the 15th century. And I certainly would never want to go back in time to live in the conditions of the 15th century. Now, I mean, I don't think any of us would want to live in America in 1910.
And maybe it's a difficult question, but just what's a typical day of a typical person in 1500s England?
Sure. Get up before dawn, work 12 hours, 14 hours, eat, go to sleep, rinse and repeat 6 days a week. Seventh day, you don't work. So, I mean.
And the nature of that work, are most people working the fields?
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
They don't own the fields, right? These fields are owned by someone else.
Most often, correct. They're serfs, working the land of the owners of the land, which would be one of the various levels of the aristocracy.
And in terms of individual rights as a serf working the land, I mean, how many do you have?
Well, first of all, well, technically you really have none
Right.
because they didn't even recognize the concept. Now, it is the case, at least they didn't recognize the concept as devised by Enlightenment and classical liberal thinkers. They did have certain rights and liberties, but those rights and liberties were determined for them um, by governments. They were not things, right. So when the Declaration talks about man's unalienable rights, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, these are rights which are grounded in human nature. They are rights which are universal and timeless. But the rights and liberties of let's say 16th century England, they were recognized not as universal and timeless. They were recognized simply as the rights of Englishmen. And those rights could change because those rights were situated in time and place. And they grew out of, basically what they did was they grew out of negotiations, oftentimes wars, between winners and losers, between masters and servants. And then oftentimes they were given to people by governments. So they were not what we call natural rights. They were rights by prescription, rights that had been, and they were rights that in effect were handed down from father to son, from father to son, etc. And they were also in those rights were oftentimes based on the social order in which you lived, right? So the rights and liberties of a nobleman were not the same as the rights and liberties of a peasant.
So we went from, I just think that's really useful for people to have a sense of what life was like 500 years ago. And as you said, that wasn't that long ago. Then with the advent of capitalism, we saw this dramatic improvement in quality of life in the Western world. But I don't think there's anything inevitable about that. Or maintaining this. I really don't. Like, if the electrical grid went down, it's foreseeable that we're back in serfdom. I mean, there's no guarantee of continuity of the Enlightenment from my perspective.
Absolutely. The Enlightenment, the scientific revolution, the technological revolution, the industrial revolution, all of these things can be reverse engineered. And the fact of the matter is, we are reverse engineering these extraordinary accomplishments of the last 400 years, right? And you see this most clearly in the so-called green movement.
By reverse engineering, you mean reversing. There are efforts to reverse these.
Oh, of course. Yeah, absolutely. The environmentalist movement is reverse engineering progress, human progress.
I see it. I see it. So we went from serfdom to capitalism, and then there was and remains, and this experiment in socialism and communism. And I just sort of have an observation. Like there are a lot of very well written and well articulated kind of criticisms of the Communist Manifesto. There's just one thing I haven't heard said that I want to say. The Chapter 2 of the Communist Manifesto, one of the goals is to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state. And the way I've always thought about this is, in a capitalist society, if you work for a startup company, you oftentimes have the opportunity to get stock options in that company, which means that you're a part owner. And if, for the big companies that have gone public, members of the public are able to buy shares. And so to me, in a capitalist society, you have the opportunity to directly own the means of production because you can own or buy shares in companies. That is a far more direct and democratized version of owning the means of production than having an unaccountable state that has a monopoly on the use of physical violence take ownership of the means of production. So
Right.
when I just like philosophically look at the Communist Manifesto, it doesn't make sense. There are better ways to achieve the same objectives that have already been achieved.
Without question, right? And the evidence is in, the evidence is clear and conclusive. And the evidence tells us that under communism, 120 million human beings were murdered, right? And hundreds of millions, if not billions of people lived in extreme poverty because of communism. And for those who managed to live and survive communism, life was a living hell for those people. It was just the opposite of what Havel says, right? To live in the truth. The communist regimes were built on nothing but lies, and of course, by the 1960s and 70s, everybody in the Soviet Union and in the Eastern Bloc knew it was built on lies, and the only refuge that they had was either to get drunk, right? To wash away your sorrows for living in this hell, not utopia, as Marx thought, but literally a living hell, or to make, like, the best jokes in the world came out of the Soviet Union, right? I mean, that's all you're left with, right? Is just telling jokes, but the one thing you can't do, right, is let those jokes be known. The problem is, you can tell a joke or two, maybe to your family members and a few other friends, but on the whole, you could be reported. Like, there's this great movie on East Berlin communism. What is it called? It's probably 25 years old now. One of the top 2 or 3 best movies, anti-communist movies, and there's this wonderful scene where they're in these members of the Politburo or members of the Communist Party are in a cafeteria having lunch. And one guy overhears another guy making a joke about communism. And it was just a joke, and they all laugh. And the man who overhears it says he's going to, put him in the gulag for 20 years. And the look of fear and panic on the joker's face was palpable. But then, of course, the guy who said it to him was joking too. But the fact is, the guy believed that it's like a real possibility. Namely, for telling a joke, I could go to the gulag for 20 years. So, I mean, it's communism is death. Either literal death or living death.
So there's another hypothesis that I've been thinking about, and I suspect you're going to disagree with this one, but I just think it ties so closely into what you just said that I just want to voice it. If the hypothesis that I put forward earlier is true, and that's an if statement. So if capitalism is effectively a gift from God, then it stands to reason that collectivism, for want of a better word, communism, is or could be basically the devil's doing on earth. And I mean that in a literal sense.
Yeah.
Because even the basic ethical principles behind this of truth and lies, I mean, those who have lived in communist states talk about that it's the lie that people tell themselves. Everyone in society becomes a liar and avoids truth, and it causes the perpetuation of this system. And I mean, Dostoevsky wrote in The Grand Inquisitor that the devil refers to himself as the spirit of self-destruction. And the spirit of self-destruction is what communism leads to.
Right.
So I just think you could make a strong argument that there's a literal connection there. Um, but okay, so I guess the last thing that I wanted to ask you about was, we've talked about the moral foundations of capitalism. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the moral foundations of the American Revolution. Um, how did so I guess the way I would lead into this question is, if you were to roll a dice and be born like just by chance at any point in human history, like what are the odds that you're born in a society that respects individual freedom and where you have a high standard of living? Like the odds of that are tiny, and you could even run the numbers on it, but like your odds are not good. And yet here we are. So I think it's really helpful for people to understand, like, how did this experiment in individualism and individual freedom come to be?
Yeah, that's a fabulous question, and not an easy question to answer in anything less than, a very large book or a 30 30 lectures. So let me up what you just said. Let me up the ante. Right? What are the odds that you could be born into a time that also produced Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, Thomas Paine, et cetera, right? I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. Now, I think the shorthand answer to the question is as follows. Colonial Americans in the 18th century lived in the freest society in the history of the world, right? So, but there are many contradictions. So they are colonials. They're living in 13 colonies up and down the North American seaboard, and they have a king. And most Americans forget this fact, that up until July 1st, 1776, Americans were monarchists. Most Americans supported the British crown, right? Up until July 3rd. And then it's only on July 4th that they break their tie with George III. So America is it's a monarchical society, but it's not England. By no means is it England. It doesn't replicate the hierarchies and the order and the deference that one sees in England. It's largely a free society. And the reason it was largely a free society is because as members of the British Empire, throughout much of the 17th and throughout much of the 18th century, Great Britain, in effect, effectively forgot its 13 American colonies. England had other issues going on at the time, right? In the 17th century, they had a civil war, they had a revolution, and in the 18th century, they've got wars with Spain and France. So they, in effect, just forgot the colonies. And these former Englishmen, now over time becoming Americanized, they are living without the long arm of the law telling them how to live their lives. So they developed what Edmund Burke once said of the American colonists, namely that they had developed the most intense spirit of liberty of any people in the history of the world. And that happened by virtue of having been left alone, to literally govern themselves, which is what they did without the British state telling them how to live their lives, right? And then secondly, what I would say, then in the 18th century, there's a kind of philosophic tsunami of ideas crashing onto American shores. And these are the ideas of the English or the British Enlightenment. The ideas, most importantly, of John Locke, and then up until 1776, Adam Smith and everything in between. So you get this, the development of we'll call it the development of a freedom philosophy, where the individual is primary. Individuals are afforded natural, unalienable rights, where governments are to be severely limited simply to the protection of rights. And you get the development eventually of a policy of laissez-faire, hands-off. And of course, the policy of hands-off is a pro-freedom philosophy. It's saying you live your life, as long as you don't violate the rights of anybody else, you get to live your life as you want to live it. And then finally, the last thing I'll say is from the moment Jamestown was founded in 1607, and Puritan Massachusetts, or the Massachusetts Bay Company, founded their colony in 1630. From the moment America was found, North America was found. Let's say founding. Tocqueville calls this the first founding, right? The founding of Jamestown, Plymouth, Massachusetts in the early 17th century. Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America says this is America's first founding. And but from the moment there was this first founding up until really the very end of the 19th century, so for almost 300 years, there was always in America a frontier, right? And if you're in Jamestown or Plymouth or Boston in the early 17th century, the frontier is literally just 20 miles inland from the Atlantic seaboard. And then with every passing decade, as these colonial Americans emigrate westward, there's always a new frontier, right? And then after the American Revolution, right? So what the American Revolution was against, it was against what we might call the imposition of the British deep state, beginning in the 1760s with the passage of the Sugar, Stamp, and Declaratory Acts, culminating in the Coercive Acts of 1774. But there's this imposition of the British, what I call the British deep state, in the 1760s and 70s. The Americans revolt, right? And one of the consequences of the American Revolution and the success of the War of Independence is that these now Americans, not colonial Britons, they were allowed to move as far west as they wanted, because there had been limitations. Basically, the Appalachian Mountains had been not only a natural barrier, but they were prohibited. The colonists were prohibited by British law from crossing over the Appalachian Mountains. So starting, in 1783, after the war ends, then you just get this, with every passing year, a steady emigration of Americans and Europeans who are coming over to the West. And wherever there is a frontier, there is freedom, right? And what that means is you have to be self-governing, self-regulating, self-reliant in the most radical sense of the term. Because if you are living literally on the frontier, where there is no government, you have to be entirely, and where there are hostile forces close by, right? You have to be literally self-governing in the most radical sense. And it changes your sense of reality. Because if you have come from Germany or Italy or even from England, and you move, let's say you land in New York or Boston, and you immediately start emigrating over the Appalachian Mountains through the Cumberland Gap, close to where you are right now, and you go to the to the area west of the Appalachian Mountains. You are now living in a place that you've never experienced before. It's pure wilderness. And you have to have a new orientation toward reality. You are almost certainly living with a climate that's different than anything you've ever experienced. The soil is completely different than anything you've ever experienced. The animals that you live amongst are different than anything you've ever experienced before. You may never have experienced a mountain lion before, right? Everything is different, and you have to be 100% self-sufficient. And that developed this, what Edmund Burke called the spirit of liberty. Americans lived fully self-governing lives almost entirely without government, if they're living on the frontier. And that's what created this idea, which is unique to the United States, of what's known as rugged individualism, right? Rugged individualism is unique to the United States. There is no French version of rugged individualism or German or Italian version of rugged individualism. It's uniquely American. In fact, I would say that the only country in the world that has replicated anything like this notion of rugged individualism would be Australia, right? Because Australians, for a long time, anybody who lived on the Australian frontier was living in conditions very similar. Namely, you had to be radically self-reliant and self-sufficient.
I'll tell you my take on Australia. Australia feels to me like that. Let me see if I can remember the saying. Tough times create strong men create good times create weak men create tough times. Australia's had it good for too long. And as a result of how good it's had it, especially due to its isolation, I mean, Australians have given up a lot of their rights, and they don't have a Bill of Rights that protects freedom of speech or freedom of religion or freedom of assembly or the right to keep and bear arms. And I think that with the pandemic, a lot of people saw that if you don't have constitutionally protected rights, then whether you know it or not, you really only have the rights that the government who's currently in power is willing to give you.
Right.
And I think a lot of people in Australia saw that when the police and army turned up at their door because they left their house for more than 20 minutes during COVID. And so I don't think that Australia comes anywhere near to the spirit of rugged individualism and the true defense of individual rights that America has succeeded in achieving.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Although I'm reminded of when I think of the we'll call it the Australian spirit of liberty. I'm reminded of the early '80s film called Gallipoli. I don't know if you ever saw it, with a very young Mel Gibson. And that was that the Australian parts of that film were in the outback, the Australian outback, which is the Australian version of the frontier. And there was a kind of spirit of independence that I saw in those Aussies. But of course, the spirit of rugged individualism in this country, just like in Australia, it diminishes with every passing year. And I would say it's not so much that the times have been too good. I would say rather that it's been an alien philosophy, of an alien philosophic virus. And it's the same virus that hit Australia, that has hit the United States. And really, in a sense, the entire world. It's like a universal plague, and that universal plague is Marxian socialism, and it can be summed up. I mean, if you were to ask me, what is the single most important principle of Marxism that people should know and understand, and most importantly reject, I would say it's this. It's a famous line from Marx. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need, right? That one sentence is the moral heart and soul of all forms of socialism, including communism. And it is the most destructive force. One sentence is the single most destructive force in world history. And even though I might not be of faith, I would describe it as satanic.
It's really funny that you say that because that's also the corruption of a biblical quote that's found within the parable of the talents. So within the parable of the talents is to each according to his ability, to each
Right.
according to his ability. And then Marx took that and corrupted it. So go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes, you're right. Marx, at the very least, took it and certainly in some form or another corrupted it. And all right. So let me take one. I said that one sentence is destroying the world. Let me reduce it to two words: weaponized guilt.
Let me add a word: weaponized collective guilt.
Sure.
Because the core of Marxism is trying to judge people by their collective group, whereas the core of individualism is that it's the individual who has value.
Yeah, no, for sure. But even I would say that it's not just towards guilt relative to a group. It's guilt relative to even oneself and the pursuit of one's happiness. Right. So it's an assault on the very concept of individual happiness and look, I think the bottom line is this: if the defenders of capitalism, whether you're a Christian or not, if the defenders of capitalism cannot defend the concept of self-interest rightly understood, then they are bound to fail in their defense of capitalism. I mean, it's a fact. Capitalism runs on self-interest, but self-interest rightly understood. And we have to actually understand that, and we have to be able to defend it morally and philosophically. Because if you can't do that, then and Marx, see, this is the great thing. Marx knew and said so, that the moral heart and soul of of capitalism is the idea of self-interest. But there has been no concept in the moral history of the world that has suffered more abuse than the idea of self-interest. But you can't evade the fact it's at the heart and soul of capitalism, and of individualism rightly understood.
So closing question is, as someone who has extensively studied the writings of the founding fathers, if the founding fathers showed up today, took a visit, what do you think their view on America in 2024 would be?
Shock and horror. I could give 1,000 examples of why they would view it with shock and horror, contempt, disgust. But I'll give you just one concrete example, which I think sums up the best. The United States of America is the first nation in world history to have its government sanction the drugging and mutilation of children. End of story.
Just so that I'm 100% clear on that example, what exactly does that refer to?
It refers to both federal and many state governments sanctioning having children drugged and mutilated in order to pretend that they are a sex other than what they actually metaphysically are.
Yes. I struggle to think of anything that is more evil than that.
Yep.
Well, on that note, I've thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. It's extremely thought-provoking, and thank you for your time.
Yeah, Matt, thank you very much. I too, I mean, I can't believe I'm looking, we've gone now for over 2 hours, and the time has just flown by. So I've very much enjoyed the conversation and look forward to meeting you in person.
That'd be great. Thank you. This episode of The Matt Sweeny Show is open sourced under the MIT license. You are free to download, use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, sell. Yes, you can use it commercially, so long as you include this notice and link to mattsweeneyshow.com. Thank you to my beautiful wife, Tusculum University, listener kids, and our contributors for making this episode possible. Support freedom and more episodes like this by contributing at mattsweeneyshow.com.